Hello, you're watching Tell It Like It Is, and my name is Kathy Benuck. Our show today is part of a two-part series on something that we're all going to get to vote on in November, and that's a state constitutional amendment that would prohibit the imposition of a state income tax here in New Hampshire. Now, the show that you're watching right now is the one in which opposition to the constitutional amendment will be presented. Now, just to give you a very quick and brief background on the proposed constitutional amendment, in January of 2011, the amendment that would prohibit the imposition of a New Hampshire state income tax, known as CACR 13, was introduced into the New Hampshire House of Representatives with 5 representatives and 3 senators sponsoring it. A year later, it was finally approved, actually on January 18th of this year, by the House with a vote of 257 to 101. This past May, the New Hampshire Senate approved an amended version with a vote of 20 to 4, and this version is what we will actually see on the ballot. Now, my guest on the opposition side to the amendment is Jeff McLynch, who is Executive Director of the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. And just to give you a little background on them, if you're not fully aware of the organization, it was founded in 2009 as an independent, nonprofit, and nonpartisan organization. It produces voluminous reports and updates on state tax, budget, and health care issues, as well as their impacts on working families here in New Hampshire. And their research is used to provide information to state legislators as well as to the public, and then to advocate and lobby for policies and planning to benefit New Hampshire citizens. The mission statement of the organization is the NHFPI, which we'll call it from here on in, is dedicated to exploring, developing, and promoting public policies that foster economic opportunity and prosperity for all New Hampshire residents, with an emphasis on low to moderate income families and individuals. It lists its goals as demystifying, good idea, the whole state budget and tax structure, and why would we say that's a good idea, and challenging costly and ineffective proposals and presenting alternatives to those proposals, as well as improving public understanding about health policy. And they particularly mention aspects of Medicaid, Medicare, and President Obama's Affordable Health Care Act, all, of course, is subject of great interest to all of us. Now, Jeff McLynch manages all operations of the NHFPI as its executive director. Prior to taking over its helm, he served as the state policy director of the Institute of Taxation and Economic Policy, where he coordinated information gathering as well as information dissemination on tax systems throughout the United States. He served as the deputy director of the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center, and as a native of Massachusetts, I can only imagine the headaches that went with that one. And he was a member of the professional staff of the Committee on Ways and Means of the United States House of Representatives, so obviously well-versed in a lot of these issues. He holds a master's degree in public policy from Georgetown University, and I have absolutely no doubt he will give you a lot to think about today. Jeff, thank you so much for coming down.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Well, it's my pleasure. Now, you know, one of the first things that, just so that people will know, I tried to give a little description of the organization,
sure.
But people always want to know more about it. Mm-hmm. So I know it started in 2009.
That's right.
Now, who actually started the organization?
Our organization was the result of a number of different folks here in New Hampshire coming together mm-hmm. and taking a look at the state's budget process and mm-hmm. policy process generally, and recognizing the need for additional information about the state budget. Okay. And not just additional information, but information that's accessible to everyone. And mm-hmm. Some people may say we're still striving towards that, and we do seek to improve as much as possible. So what we do on a regular basis, for instance, is put out reports, short ones, long ones, in between mm-hmm. ones, for policymakers, because as you know, at the State House, mm-hmm. There are many legislators, but only a few staff, mm-hmm. and so it's best to have as much information as possible. We also try to make it available to members of the media like yourself when they mm-hmm. report on these issues, when they discuss these issues with their guests, and also to the general public, because mm-hmm. New Hampshire citizens pride themselves on being informed voters, and we want to help them achieve that. And so, for instance, if you take, for instance, the state budget process, what we did, since we've only been around for one budget process now, what we did in 2010 is that we tried to explain what was in the governor's proposal. And then when it moved on to the House, we tried to detail what that contained. And similarly with the Senate, we tried to put forward some additional information about what the differences were between the two chambers of the legislature, and then we tried to explain what those consequences might be. And we'll do the same again when the budget comes up for consideration in January of next year, when there's a new legislature in place. Of course, the state budget is the only thing the state does, and so we weigh in on other debates as well. There have been a number of discussions about taxes here in New Hampshire over the past few years, and there have been about half a dozen tax cuts that have been adopted. We've tried to weigh in to point out the trade-offs that might be entailed with, say, for instance, prohibiting the taxation of internet access. And then, because we operate in a federal system, there are federal policies that affect people in New Hampshire, and we try to discuss what the consequences of those would be. So, for instance, the Affordable Care Act, as it's sort of gradually being implemented, helping people understand what that might mean for their health care coverage, their insurance, and so forth.
And these are all, a lot of them are very complicated issues. And I mean, truth be told, legislators have hundreds of bills.
Absolutely.
And as you say, in New Hampshire, it's not like they have huge staffs to kind of go through them and give them the, the crib notes on them or whatever.
Right.
So organizations like yours obviously perform a service to them, because otherwise they'd be just buried.
Right, and we just want to make sure that people have the best information available to them.
Sure. Now, is it a membership organization?
No, we're completely independent. The large majority of our funding comes from foundations. We're fortunate to receive support from the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, from the Endowment for Health, from the NEKC Foundation, and that's how we finance our operations.
That was one of my questions.
Sure, yep.
Okay, that's great. But if people wanted to get on, like, your email list or something, they can
absolutely.
do that.
It's completely free. If people want to see the publications we've produced, all of them are on our website.
Which we'll give, and it will be on the screen.
And I can say it now, it's nhfpi.org.
There you go.
And people can sign up for updates there. If they want to receive publications as they come out, they can look back through our archives and see where we've weighed in. We also try to provide reports from other organizations around the state and from nationally on issues that
I saw you had a lot of links.
So just
which
so
is
people
nice.
have that
People can
available to
then
them.
kind of go and see what other folks have to say too. Now, I know that NHFPI testified against the constitutional amendment in April before the state Senate Internal Affairs Committee, and you did say that there was no need for it now, since nobody is currently pushing hard for one. Now, obviously, a lot of people in New Hampshire think it won't be long before somebody is pushing for one. So to that end, why do you think that opponents of an income tax should now vote against the constitutional amendment?
Well, I think you hit on it there, because it's a constitutional amendment. And I think what's critical here is we're not talking about the merits of an income tax per se, but about the most basic and fundamental document we have in our state, the New Hampshire Constitution. And when it comes to making changes to something like that, from our perspective, there needs to be a clear and demonstrated need. And so far, this amendment, which will be question 2 on the ballot, has not demonstrated that need. To date, whenever there's been a consideration of an income tax in New Hampshire, the tools that we have in place to approve or disapprove of policy changes, elections, and the legislative process have represented the will of the people. The people have not wanted an income tax. We don't have an income tax, and it can be that way going forward, even without a constitutional amendment. But once you put a constitutional amendment in place, that may subvert the will of the people into the future. It takes options off the table for future generations.
Now, obviously, you mentioned it would appear on the November ballot as question 2, and I'll just, because it's so short, I'll tell our viewers what it's actually going to say. What you'll see on the ballot is the following: are you in favor of amending the second part of the Constitution by inserting after Article 5B a new article to read as follows, and that will actually be called Article 5C. Notwithstanding any general or special provision of this Constitution, the General Court shall not have the power of authority to impose and levy any assessment, rate, or tax upon income earned by any natural person. However, nothing in this article should be construed to prohibit any tax in effect on January 1st, 2012, or adjustment to the rate of such a tax. Now, I think most of us know that the words General Court refers to the New Hampshire legislature.
That's right.
But I know that your organization does feel that the wording of the question is very confusing to people, particularly with reference to the words natural person. And that kind of jumped out at me too. I mean, kind of kidding around, I said, what does this mean? Does it mean that, does natural person make us assume that they believe, or it's no inference that we have supernatural people here in the state, or what?
We can't tax ghosts. That's what it means. No, in all seriousness, really the sort of wording of the amendment really highlights the difficulties anyone faces in trying to insert particular policies into the Constitution, and especially in New Hampshire, which has a relatively unusual constitution when it comes to taxes, the difficulty is all that much greater. So take, for instance, the question of natural person. Previously, that language hadn't been in there as the amendment was considered in the legislature. The Senate amended it to be natural person to try to distinguish between natural people like you and me and the voters and legal persons like corporations, because there have been some...
Oh, way to say it. Why did they just say that?
Well, that's just it. As, you add words to the Constitution, and
really.
Words have meaning when you put them in a legal scope. So, and that was necessary because New Hampshire's Constitution, when it comes to taxes, requires uniformity. And so they're trying to make sure that there weren't going to be any implications for businesses as a result of this particular amendment. However, some of the analysis that's been done on this amendment by a professor at the University of New Hampshire Law Center, Marcus Hearn,
I read that,
suggests that there may still be unintended consequences from this approach because of that uniformity clause. And if you begin to try to distinguish between certain types of businesses, i.e. corporations versus proprietors or partnerships, that may have unintended consequences and could lead to things like, right now we don't have a graduated rate structure for our business taxes. It's a single flat rate. This could be resolved by introducing that kind of graduated rate structure, and that's something that I don't think any proponent of the amendment intends, but yet it could be an outcome nevertheless.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I wondered about that. Now, I'm not a lifelong resident in New Hampshire. Actually, I'm a Massachusetts native, and I'm certainly not an expert on the history of New Hampshire elections. Now, obviously, amending the Constitution is kind of a big deal. Is there any kind of recent history here in New Hampshire on ballot questions to amend the Constitution?
Sure. So our Constitution's been in place since the 1780s, 1790s, and there have been about, I want to say, around 24 changes over the span of that time.
Okay.
Since 1980, the method for amending the Constitution has changed somewhat. Previously, it could only be done via constitutional convention. Now, the legislature can, as they did in this instance, bring forward a bill, approve it by a supermajority vote, and put it to the voters. Since 1980, I think we've only had 4 or 5 changes to the Constitution. The most recent was in 2006 when changes in representation in House districts occurred so that you could have single-member districts.
I vaguely remember that, yeah.
Right. So, but by and large, there have not been many changes in the last 30 years. Most changes that have been proposed have been rejected by the voters.
Now, when there were changes, did you see, or do you know, were there like lots of challenges and legal challenges and Supreme Court decisions and all that good stuff afterwards?
I'm not too familiar with the recent history. I do know that in sort of looking into this question about taxes, that, and this is relatively ancient history now, there was an amendment, a pretty significant amendment to the Constitution in 1903 dealing with tax policy, and it took several decades for that to be sorted out.
Decades.
Right, for that to be sorted out via the court system. And I don't know that we'll have that protracted legal battle about it with this particular amendment if it were to become law, but there's certainly unanswered questions with it.
Okay. Now, a lot of proponents claim, proponents of an income tax, and I've heard them claim that they like it because they truly believe that it will lower property taxes, but experiences in, I don't know, all states, but certainly some states, probably closest to us, maybe Connecticut, don't offer proof of that. So I guess I'll jump ahead and say, what is the opposition of your organization to an income tax overall?
Well, I mean, to the question about what's happened in other states, I think every
definitely.
I think every state is different, and it all comes down to the specifics, so that when people talk about an income tax in New Hampshire, it's a pretty amorphous subject. It could be, when people commonly think about an income tax, they think about the federal income tax. Under our Constitution, we couldn't have anything like that. Also, people don't really talk about the details of what it might mean. An income tax could be used to reduce business taxes in New Hampshire, could be used to reduce property taxes, could be used to finance certain services. So there's a lot of sort of very important questions that would need to be answered. But when it comes down to it, this constitutional amendment really isn't about the sort of specifics of an income tax. It's really not about the merits of an income tax. It's about how we govern ourselves and the choices that we make for ourselves as a state. And this amendment seeks to limit those choices. Right now, people may not like the idea of an income tax very much, but my kids, when they get to be voters or when they become professionals here in the state or work here in the state, and your children and grandchildren and my grandchildren, they may have different views about that. And we shouldn't impose limits on sort of the choices that they might have in the future. And when you talk about a constitution, that's the kind of time scale, that's the sort of horizon that you ought to be thinking about.
Now, let me ask you this, and I mean, not an official position, just kind of a conversational question. Let's say, for instance, an income tax did come into effect in New Hampshire. Do you think that would open the door for other broad-based taxes, like a sales tax, for example?
I mean, again, I think it comes down to the specifics. Anytime you want to talk about a major tax change like a sales tax or an income tax, you really ought to ask the question, well, what problem are you trying to solve? And New Hampshire's tax system does suffer from several flaws. And so you want to think about, is this particular approach the best way to treat those? And so a sales tax may have some merits, an income tax may have some merits, other tax reforms may have other merits, they may also have drawbacks. But if this amendment were to become part of the Constitution, we wouldn't be able to have that conversation at all.
Totally.
At least as it pertains to the sales tax. Excuse me, the income tax.
Income tax. Of course, some people would say yippee.
That's right. Some people would like that, but later on down the road, that people may have different views.
Okay, all right. Now, here in Bedford, in last week's primary election, we were asked to weigh in on 3 different amendments to the town charter, and that actually required a separate ballot. So, you know, counting them and all that business. Will that be the case with this as well? For question 2 to become part of the Constitution requires a 2/3 vote of the people. And the way that that 2/3 is calculated is that it's 2/3 of all ballots with a response. So if you don't vote on this question, your ballot is not counted. So if you are opposed to this particular question, you need to be sure to vote no. Will there be an actual separate ballot handed to us?
I don't know the specific mechanics.
Yeah, I
know
wondered
that
about that.
There are going to be 3 questions pertaining to the Constitution in November. There's this one on the income tax. That's question 2. There's also question 1, which deals with which essentially would give the legislature a role in setting rules within the court system. And then there's a 3rd question that asks whether we want to have a constitutional convention to consider further changes.
Now, yeah, here we are. We're in getting toward the end of September, actually. And I'm not hearing very many people talk about any of this, even the media, which kind of strikes me as weird because, I mean, at least this issue is kind of a big one. And it's like, I don't even know if most people know that they'll be voting on it.
I think given New Hampshire's status as a key battleground state with the presidential election and the fact that we have an open gubernatorial seat and 2 congressional seats up, I think there's a lot of other topics to occupy voters' minds.
True. I just wonder how many people will see these questions on the ballot and not have the vaguest idea what they're about or what they mean.
I mean, I do think people are beginning to make up their minds. If you look at some of the recent polling that's been done on the subject,
there have been polls lately?
There have been some polls, not specifically geared towards this, but that do ask about this. And I think by and large, people do not like the idea of putting this into the Constitution. There's split support. 40% say they do like it, about 45% say they don't like it, which suggests it's still an undecided. But again, to get it into the Constitution, you'd need a 2/3 vote. So,
do you see any, or has this survey been done, a party line affiliation with one position or another?
I think that I'm sure that there has been. I think that there's probably, people typically portray Republicans as anti-tax, but I do think that there's a fair number of Republicans who responded that they would not support something like this. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, Foster's Daily Democrat recently opined on this topic, and they suggested that, this is sort of antithetical to the notion of a democracy. In a democracy, one of its hallmarks is the free exchange of ideas. That's how we arrive at the truth, that we consider different questions, people bring different information to bear, and we get to the truth via that. And if we're limiting the discussion, we're not going to get there. Secondly, and this was brought up during the House debates on the measure, there are some Republicans, and they stated this on the floor, so I'm not sort of impugning any motives to them, who said, we shouldn't do this because this is a great issue for us to run on. We like being able to say, vote for me, I will prevent an income tax from becoming law, and if this becomes part of the Constitution, I won't be able to say that anymore.
Well, of course, on the other side of the coin, though, the Democrats kind of played with it in the primary election too. Pledge, I'll take the pledge, or I won't take the pledge.
And that's fair. I mean, there was a conversation about whether we should essentially do the equivalent of one step short of this and have the pledge.
Yeah.
Right.
True. Yeah. Now, obviously, there will be some people who, no matter how it comes about, would continue to oppose the state income tax. So, short of a constitutional amendment, is there another avenue for people who genuinely believe that
I think
that should not happen?
I think if people don't want an income tax, they should keep doing what they've been doing, because that's worked.
You mean lobby their own legislators?
They should lobby their legislators, vote for a particular candidate, be a part of the legislative process, and that's really what the core of this is. We have tools readily available, regularly used, quite effective tools, elections and the legislative process, to affect policies here in New Hampshire, chief among them the state's tax system.
Now, I know when we had interviewed some of the gubernatorial candidates, one in particular is in favor, he did not win the primary election, but he was very open in saying that he had no problem with an income tax. And he felt as though it was the only equitable means of taxation. And I know your organization is committed to representing, middle-class folks. Do you feel the same way? Do you think that really is the only equitable way of everybody paying their fair share?
Well, as I said earlier, I think whenever you talk about major changes in the tax system, you have to think about, well, what are we trying to address? And one of the flaws of New Hampshire's tax system is that it is regressive, that it asks more of low and middle income people than it does of upper income people. The latest information...
Now, can you explain that a little for people who don't know what that means?
The latest information that we have is from 2007, and it indicates that people in the bottom of the income distribution, the poorest 20% of people here in New Hampshire, pay an effective tax rate of a little bit more than 8%. 8% of their income goes to state and local taxes in New Hampshire. If you contrast that with people at the very top of the income distribution, the richest 1%, they pay an effective tax rate of about 2%, 2% of their income.
So this would include what? Property taxes?
It includes property taxes. It includes excise taxes like gas taxes, or the electricity consumption tax, or communications services tax, all the various taxes that we impose here in New Hampshire. And so that sort of regressive tax system makes it harder for working people to come out of poverty, to make ends meet, to invest in their kids and themselves. And so if New Hampshire were to make changes to its tax system, it might be able to address that problem. An income tax might be one way to do that, but there are changes short of a broad-based tax that could help mitigate that. For instance, property taxes are obviously a big issue here in New Hampshire. It's a key source of revenue for the state, but we don't do the same things that other states do to try to lessen that burden on low and moderate income people. We don't have large homestead exemptions. We don't have a particularly meaningful, what's called a circuit breaker, which is a sort of a tax credit that tries to limit how much of your income you pay towards property taxes. We have a very small program. It helps about 12,000 people every year, but it used to be much more significant. People helped about 24,000 to 36,000 people per year. If we made changes to that, that might help address that problem. So that's one thing short of an income tax that we could do to address regressivity.
Okay, and the major reason I asked that is because a couple people actually said to me, does that mean that somehow wealthier people don't have to pay the same tax as somebody who doesn't make as much money as them. So, you know, that's the
Sure.
main thing I wanted you to clarify, that
right.
that's
I
not
mean,
the
I think
case.
we all,
it's based on how much of their own personal income goes out.
Sure. To give you a specific example,
Yeah.
we all pay the same gas tax.
Sure. Sure.
18 cents on the gallon
Right,
means a
right.
lot more to somebody making
Of course.
$20,000 a year than it does to
Of
somebody
course it
making
does, yeah.
120. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, believe it or not, that clock is running out.
Well, time flies.
Is there, you know, and I tried to kind of cover the major
Sure.
things that you've been putting across. Is there something that we missed that you really want to get across to everybody watching
I guess
show?
what I would just emphasize is that when people go into the booth in November to make their decisions about the president and the governor and their state representatives, they're also going to be making decisions about our Constitution. And any changes to that document should demonstrate a clear need. And so far, we don't have a clear need demonstrated for this sort of change. We have tools available to us to affect policies in New Hampshire, and we should continue to use those tools.
Okay, and what do you think is the best way for people to really kind of equip themselves to be fully informed on all this?
There's a number of editorials that have already been put out by various newspapers across the state. We've been trying to compile them on our website. That's www.nhfpi.org. People can get that information there. There's also, I think, the Secretary of State's office will have the specific wording so people can review that in advance.
And anybody can actually sign up to get on your email list,
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
Okay.
Yep, free of charge. And if you don't like what you're hearing,
We all like
then,
free.
you can
We all
unsubscribe
like
anytime.
free.
Everybody loves free.
Now, we have time for like a real fast question, you know, because you were so good at kind of summing up there. Do you think that if we do not have a state income tax, this is good or bad for business?
I think that one of the outcomes of this constitutional amendment might be to keep our current tax system in place. And if
Okay.
we need to generate additional revenue, that means going back to taxes we already have. And chief among those are our business taxes.
Okay.
So that we could become even more reliant upon those taxes over time if we take choices off the table.
So then I take that to mean you think business people should really be
Business
watching
people
this.
ought to be concerned about this.
Okay.
Not only for the reason I highlighted earlier, that there may be unintended consequences,
Sure.
but it just freezes things in place, and businesses have already expressed some dissatisfaction with the current system. This creates the chance that it will just exacerbate that problem.
Okay. Good answer. Yeah. Well, listen, I wish we could talk more, and the door's open.
Well,
you know,
I appreciate
if you need
the
to
offer.
come back more before the election is over.
Okay.
And I don't know, one way or another, regardless of the outcome, I have a sneaking suspicion there'll still be lots of dialogue about it.
We will
for
remain
months to
busy.
come.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
No doubt about it.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, if you know, when you know that there's things the public needs to know, would love to have you back.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you for
Please
coming.
don't hesitate to call.
Thank you. Well, I hope that helps all of you to understand one side of the issue, and of course we will have a second show that looks at the other side of the issue. Like so much in government, there's no real simple answer. And, you know, it's really hard to say anything is black or anything is white. There's always that gray, and that's where we all have to be able to say, okay, let's analyze before we decide whether we go black or whether we go white. So that's what this show is about, telling it like it is. We've had yet another guest who did a good job of telling it like it is from his point of view. All of you need to do the same. I'll continue to do so. So thanks so much for watching, and until next time, bye-bye.